My Years with the Mises Institute. By Stephan Kinsella on May 2, 2026. Introduction. Hans Hoppe recently published Mises Institute, Quo Vadis, which contains various criticisms of the Mises Institute, MI, as it is currently organized. He has since been removed as Distinguished Senior Fellow by the Mises Institute. I fully support Hans and do not disagree with anything he wrote. Here I would like to mention my own experience with the Mises Institute, with which I have been associated, on and off, for over 30 years, since 1994. I have discussed some of this history previously, but as my experience has certain parallels to that of Hans, I will go into more detail here than I have in the past. Despite my critical remarks here, I, too, share Hans's admiration for Lew Rockwell, discussed below, and what he achieved with the Mises Institute. I love the mission of the Mises Institute and the role it has played for the last 44 years. It is due to my concern over the decline of the Mises Institute, and its treatment of Hans, that I publish these remarks. Pursuit of liberty is always a quest for truth. But truth is fragile and seems easily cast aside by those with more base motives. With that in mind, I offer some of my own thoughts on these matters, entreating the reader to judge the reasonableness of my position, and that of Hoppe. The Mises Institute as intellectual home. Since its founding in 1982, the Mises Institute has served as a kind of intellectual home for many people. It was a place that spread the ideas of liberty and Austrian economics and, after it found its permanent location in Auburn, and then later its main campus and building there, a place where people could meet, network, learn, make friends and so on. This was true during its first years, from 1982 to the advent of the Internet in the mid-1990s. From the late 1990s to about 2012, after the Internet, websites, YouTube, blogs, and digital files started to emerge, its popularity and impact only increased when, under Jeffrey Tucker's initiative, and also Doug French joining as president in 2009, the Mises Institute and Mises.org took advantage of the Internet and digital information to make a mammoth amount of Austrian and libertarian material available free and open online. The Mises Institute became Rothbard's intellectual home upon its founding in 1982, during its pre-Internet phase. It also became Hoppe's, soon after he joined Rothbard in 1985 and closely worked and associated with him, as well as the Mises Institute, until Rothbard's death a decade later, in 1995. Thus, Hans opens his recent missive Mises Institute, Quo Vadis, with an acknowledgement of his long-standing close connection to the Mises Institute. My close, personal association with the Mises Institute goes back more than 40 years, to 1985, only 3 years after the Institute's founding. In the course of the years I have given dozens upon dozens of lectures. I have been awarded its Schlagbaum Prize and the Rothbard Medal. For a decade, I served as editor of its Journal of Libertarian Studies. I am the Mises Institute's only long-standing Distinguished Senior Fellow. Only 2 years ago, in 2024, I was a featured speaker at the Institute's Human Action Conference, and my 75th birthday was celebrated at the occasion. In the same year I sent this congratulatory note to Lew Rockwell at the occasion of the festivities organized in honor of his own 80th birthday. Dear Lew, to your 80th birthday I send you my best wishes and want to say thanks for by now almost 40 years of friendship and intellectual camaraderie. I know you are too humble to say this, but I can certainly do it. You rank among the most brilliant commentators and analysts of the present age, and you are the world's greatest living promoter of sound economics in the tradition of Ludwig von Mises and Murray N. Rothbard and, more generally, of liberty, peace, common sense, and reason. Your legacy is assured, you are already a legend. Yours truly, Hans. As noted above, I share Hans's admiration for what Lew achieved with the Mises Institute. Returning to Hans's connection to the Mises Institute, as he said in one recent talk, Here though, I thank Lou Rockwell, Tom DiLorenzo, and Joseph Salerno for the invitation. And to clear up the veteran part in my lecture, I should point out that my first visit to Auburn took place in, I think, in the fall of '85 or in the spring of 1986. So Auburn for me is my sweet home in Alabama. End of quote. In Coming of Age with Murray, Hans recounts moving to New York in 1985 specifically to work with Rothbard, then details how the Mises Institute became the crucial institutional support for him and Rothbard and others when academia and limited government outfits shunned radical Austro-libertarianism, until the arrival of Lou Rockwell and the Mises Institute. I have remained closely connected from its humble beginnings to the present day. The Mises Institute itself, in its 2024 Human Action Conference announcement, explicitly noted this close relationship. Mises Institute senior fellows, and associated scholars will deliver presentations on the significance of human action. Returning to his intellectual home for the first time since COVID, Dr. Hans-Hermann Hoppe will deliver a keynote lecture. These thinkers' contributions will be compiled into a commemorative volume in honor of Mises's seminal work. End of quote. The Mises Institute has played a similar role for countless others. It was what drew them to the Mises Institute, to its people, publications, resources, conferences, and events. As Brettin Schaffer, the daughter of Butler Schaffer, longtime legal scholar affiliated with the Mises Institute, recently wrote, "It is also a home for many intellectuals who might otherwise have found themselves homeless." She recounts how the Mises Institute and LouRockwell.com offered a lifeline to Butler, and it also became his intellectual home. And also mine? Starting a bit in the middle of my story, in 2002, when I was 37 years old and practicing law in Houston, after a 3-year stint in Philadelphia from 1994 to 1997, about 8 years after becoming associated with the Mises Institute, I concluded my 2002 LouRockwell.com article How I Became a Libertarian thus. Since then, meeting Rothbard and Hoppe in 1994, I have attended many Mises Institute conferences, including every one of the annual Austrian Scholars Conferences, initiated, in 1995. Over the years I gained more appreciation for Mises and Austrian economics, and for the unparalleled scope of Rothbard's scholarly contributions to economics and political philosophy, and related fields. I am now not only an anarcho-libertarian, but a Misesian Austrian. I have gained an increasingly deeper respect for Lou Rockwell, and the singular achievement that is the Mises Institute. It has become my intellectual home. End of quote. While my appreciation of the ideas of Mises, Rothbard, and Hoppe has only deepened and grown over the years, and as I have integrated it more and more into my own understanding of liberty, as can be seen in the book I recently edited and published with Hans, Rothbard at 100, a tribute and assessment, as well as my chapter Mises, Rothbard, Hoppe, an indispensable framework. Its status as my intellectual home began to decline around 10 years later, in 2013. First contact. But let me go back to the beginning. As is my wont, as I have recounted elsewhere, as an adolescent but always interested in books, science, and philosophy, but was essentially apolitical, politically tabula rasa. As for so many others, for me it also began with Ayn Rand. A librarian at Catholic High School in Baton Rouge, who knew I loved to read and talk about ideas, commended The Fountainhead to me in my sophomore year, in 1980. And also as for so many others, this soon led me to libertarianism and to Austrian and other free market economics. By college I was a very Randian libertarian. I went to hear Ron Paul speak at the LSU campus during his 1988 Libertarian Party run for president. At the time I was more Randian and pro-choice and still suspicious of the libertarians because of Ayn Rand's critical comments, and went there to find out if libertarians were pro-choice or not. Ron's ambiguous answer to my question made me suspicious. I ended up voting for him anyway in 1988. I loved technology and the natural sciences. Electrical engineering was my undergrad and grad school major, but for various reasons, including an interest in economics, philosophy, and the social sciences and even the humanities in general, and increasingly in law, I entered law school in 1988, right as I was transitioning from Randian Minikism to Rothbardian anarcho-capitalism. As the joke has it, what's the difference between a Minikist and an anarchist? About 6 months. It took me a bit longer, but I've seen that process play out many times. I was influenced by many anarchist works, Rothbard's For a New Liberty, the Tanhill's The Market for Liberty, Bruce Benson, David Friedman, and so on. And then in my first year of law school I read Hoppe's article The Ultimate Justification of the Private Property Ethic in the September 1988 issue of Liberty, which, at the time, I would read cover to cover, along with other periodicals like The Freeman, The Free Market, Reason, Access to Energy, The Konzak Report, The Rothbard-Rockwell Report, The Intellectual Activist, Imprimis, The Laissez-Faire Books Catalogue, and so on. This article changed my life. Hoppe's argument captivated and fascinated me and drew me to his work, to his powerful intellectual framework. After a eureka moment in contracts law class, fall semester 1988, it stimulated me to build on it using the estoppel concept I had been learning about in contract law class to develop my own complementary theory of rights. In January 1992, while in grad school pursuing an LL.M. in international law from King's College London, I wrote a handwritten letter to Hoppe, Jan. 31, 1992, to introduce myself and mention my draft article based on my estoppel-based rights theory. I submitted it to King's College London's Law Journal, which was my first try, How Naive I Was, and other fora, such as Liberty, Reason, Jeffrey Friedman's Critical Review, and so on. It was rejected by all of them, but someone at Tibor Macken's Reason papers liked it. I found out just recently that it was Eric Mack, writing this is a clever and, for the most part, meticulously developed essay. My first serious published academic article, it was ultimately published there in 1992, just as I was beginning my first year of legal practice in Houston. Hoppe's argument was elaborated on in his 1989 A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, and also in his 1993 The Economics and Ethics of Private Property. I wrote a lengthy review essay, The Undeniable Morality of Capitalism, published in St. Mary's Law Journal in 1994, and a shorter review for Fee's Journal, still called The Freeman. I sent the longer one on to Hoppe in August 1994, and he sent me back a warm thank you note, referring to me as Dr. Kinsella, the first time that happened, but not the last. In the intervening years many people assume I'm a PhD, a sort of honorary doctorate I take more pride in than the meaningless PhDs most academics have. In his letter he told me he thought my estoppel argument beautifully complemented his argumentation ethics. I had actually, mildly, criticized some of Hoppe's arguments in the review, but he still liked it. It was favorable, after all, and published in a respectable mainstream publication. This feedback, as well as that of the Reason Papers referee, belated thanks, Eric, was very encouraging to a young independent scholar. By this time I had moved to Philadelphia for a few years for career reasons, and got wind of a meeting of the Mises Institute Paleolibertarians and the Chronicles crowd Paleoconservatives held October the 21st to the 22nd, 1994 at the Crystal City Marriott Hotel in Arlington, Virginia. Maybe Hoppe or someone at the Mises Institute told me about it. I don't recall. Maybe it was Lou Rockwell, whom I had met by telephone years before. This was during one of the fusionist phases, attempts of conservative libertarians and conservatives to unite, but I went there primarily to meet Hoppe and Rothbard. I actually already knew Lou, since about 1988 or so. As I wrote previously, I was visiting my friend Jack Criss, then a libertarian AM radio talk show host in Jackson, Mississippi, and was in the studio while Jack interviewed Lou by phone. During a commercial, I talked to Lou and told him how much I admired his superb The Free Market Reader, 1988, and other work, we had already corresponded, I believe. It wasn't until the 1994 conference that we met in person. I didn't much care for the Chronicles crowd I met there, Sam Francis, Tom Fleming, and others, though I did like Paul Gottfried and over the years got to know him better, as he has also attended several PFS events. Some of them seemed to be doing the creepy sovereign thing of worshipping the rebel flag and the Confederacy, smoking cigars and holding court in their hotel rooms and so on. I did not feel welcome or especially want to be. I was from Louisiana, but only geographically, so to speak. At the event, I had a long talk with Rothbard when we both arrived at a meeting room early, and got him to sign my copy of Man, Economy, and State. When he died unexpectedly 3 months later, the following January, Hans took over the editorship of the Journal of Libertarian Studies, as he was the obvious choice. I started regularly attending the Austrian Scholars Conference held every spring in Auburn, starting in about 1992 and going until about 2012, I believe. I would sometimes attend other Mises Institute conferences, but I almost always presented something at the ASC, always with Hoppe's encouragement and, sometimes, guidance. Many of these papers were published in the JLS, many were incorporated in my 2023 book LFFS. So my current intellectual framework clearly developed and grew out of my early scholarly years at the Mises Institute and my exposure to the ideas of Mises, Rothbard, and Hoppe, and so many others. I made a host of friends and contacts at the Mises Institute events over the years, many of them by now lifelong friends, including Guido Hulsmann, whom I happened to sit next to on the shuttle from ATL Airport to Auburn for our first ASC together in 1995. We were both going there for Hans. Guido was an economics PhD student, and I was an aspiring Austro-libertarian legal theorist. Guido and I quickly became close friends at that very event, and though we lived far apart, we have remained friends, collaborators, and supporters and students of Hans. Hans and I became closer as well, and I eventually helped him with the JLS, first with an attempted but short-lived feature, the Libertarian Literature Review, and then as book review editor, 2000 to 2004. The first sign of trouble in paradise occurred in 2005 when, to our surprise, after a decade of editing the JLS, Hans was removed as editor. He was thrown a bone and relegated to some meaningless title like editor emeritus or at large. It was not clear why this happened, but Hans was upset and a bit mystified. It made no sense to me. It was great under his tenure, and he was the obvious and best person to do it. I heard later that the reason given was that he was behind schedule. This was untrue. I can see now, in retrospect, after a great deal of experience writing, publishing, and editing many books and my own journal, that it was a make-weight reason. Left libertarian Roderick Long, who was still affiliated with the Mises Institute and apparently a senior fellow, more on this below, was hired. He was a disaster as editor. He started publishing more left libertarian material like that of Kevin Carson, and in any case it fell far behind schedule. Tom Woods was briefly enlisted to take over, but that did not last long. With the JLS falling apart, I had the idea to replace it with a new, online, and print, journal embracing the internet. I brainstormed this with Jeff Tucker one night, got Hans's enthusiastic support, and, with Tucker's help, I quickly formed a website, recruited an editorial board from contacts I had developed through the Mises Institute, and we were off to the races with the innovative new journal Libertarian Papers. I published Libertarian Papers for 10 years, at first somewhat informally under the Mises Institute's auspices. I retained ownership and control of the domain and website, but less clearly so over time, and after a few years enlisted Matt McCaffrey to step in as day-to-day editor. More on this later. In any case, in 2005 or so Hans was removed as editor of the JLS. He was upset at the time but he accepted it. He had been paid a meager stipend of $500 per month and was told this would continue. It did not. This lie, as well as his senseless demotion to executive editor or editor-at-large, I cannot recall, and the lame excuses behind his demotion should have raised suspicions, but we were naive and I, at least, mostly shrugged this off. But this event must have alerted Hoppe's spidey sense. He must have sensed that being dependent on such fickle people was a precarious position to be in. The next year, in 2006, founded the Property and Freedom Society, PFS, in Bodrum, Turkey, the site of the Hotel Karya Princess, a family hotel owned by the family of his soon-to-be wife, Gülçin Imre, an Austrian economics PhD student who had also begun attending the Mises Institute events as she worked on her PhD. With the recent troubles exposed in Hans's recent article, we can see how prescient he was to establish his own base of operations. Staying independent. I had an obvious academic and scholarly bent, and for a time I flirted with the idea of academia. To that end, as a young attorney, I enrolled in the University of London's PhD, Laws programme from 1996 to 2000, with renowned Dworkin scholar Dr. Stephen Guest as my advisor. My application was supported by helpful recommendation letters from Hoppe, Randy Barnett, and Saul Litvinov. I eventually decided not to join academia but to maintain my legal career and treat my scholarly interests as an avocation or side pursuit. I thought being an independent scholar was the best path for me. Thus, for similar reasons, was also uninterested in joining the think tank world in any dependent capacity, or having a career in the liberty world. So when some opportunities arose, I never pursued them. For example, early in my career, in studying argumentation ethics, I came across similar or related arguments, which I wrote about in a 1996 JLS article, New Rationalist Directions in Libertarian Rights Theory. One of these was the interesting libertarian-oriented rights theory of Roger Pilon of Cato. So I began corresponding and talking to him. As I recounted in Disinvited from Cato, Pilon and I continued to correspond, such as this letter, May 6, 1997, he wrote me in 1997, proposing possibly commissioning a study about how to improve property rights in the international arena, probably in response to some of my recent legal writing in that area, for example my book Protecting Foreign Investment Under International Law, Legal Aspects of Political Risk, Dobbs Ferry, New York, Oceana Publications, 1997, and related articles. A couple years later, in 1999 or so, I distinctly remember, I was on a vacation with my wife and brother in beautiful Capri, Italy, and was checking my work email from a laptop from the hotel room. Yes, apparently it was possible back then, somehow, I think via long-distance dial-up modem, and received an inquiry from Pilon as to whether I was interested in a new position Cato was creating, editor of a Supreme Court law review. It would involve a career change, a move to DC, being a talking head on TV on occasion, and a generous salary, but still, for me, a cut in pay, since I was by then a successful large firm patent attorney, and so on. It was never even a question for me. I did not hesitate or agonize about it. I didn't even run it by the wife. I immediately said no politely, but decisively. I didn't want to move to DC or take a pay cut or be beholden to non-profit bosses. I'm so glad I said no, and that I've remained intellectually independent since. I never wanted to be a kept or house intellectual, and am glad of my decision, and related ones in years following, to this day. I like keeping my libertarian intellectual interests as an avocation and being my own benefactor from my normal job, thank you. That way, one can maintain independence and integrity. My mind is my own, man. End of quote. Turning back to the Mises Institute, around the same time, Lou Rockwell hinted at a similar opportunity with the Institute. I believe it was around 2000 or so, or perhaps a bit later, before the Mises Institute had completely moved its conferences, such as the ASC, to their new building in Auburn. In 1995 and for a few years after, the ASC was held at the Auburn Hotel and Conference Center. Doug French was hired as Mises Institute's first non-Rockwell president in 2009, but Lou must have been considering hiring a successor for some time before Doug was finally hired. I recall Lou and I were alone in the Auburn Hotel Conference Center area where coffee was served between presentations. He mentioned to me he was looking for a president to replace him. I must have said something like, perhaps some smart and ambitious young economics professor is who you need. He looked at me and said something like, or maybe a smart young lawyer. I was not sure if he was serious, but I changed the subject and never brought it up again. That career path did not interest me at all. I was doing well as a big firm attorney and would never take a pay cut, and, as noted above, I preferred to be my own benefactor and keep my vocation and avocation, my career and calling, separate. Getting more involved, the open publishing revolution. Increased involvement and libertarian papers. In any case, my involvement with the Mises Institute only increased. I kept speaking at the ASC, and helped Hans with the JLS, becoming book review editor and so on. In 2002, I was invited to deliver 3 lectures in the week-long Rothbard Graduate Seminar, July the 28th to August the 2nd, 2002. As I became more prominent and started being invited to speak, such as at Mises.U or other events, I would usually decline the fee or reimbursement. Or I would take part of it, to have some speaking income to justify treating that side hustle or avocation as a Schedule C business for tax purposes, for deducting business expenses and the like. I also had a lucrative legal publishing side gig going at the time, and donate money separately. In addition to speaking regularly at Mises Institute events, I attended the inaugural meeting of Hoppe's PFS, in May 2006 in Bodrum, Turkey. I blogged a lot on the Mises blog. I also on occasion gave free legal advice. I co-edited, with Guido Hulsmann, the Mises Institute's 2009 Festschrift for Hoppe, Property, Freedom, and Society, Essays in honor of Hans-Hermann Hoppe. This was Guido's idea, but it was supported and published by the Mises Institute. After the disastrous and inexplicable decision to fire Hans from the JLS and Roderick Long's short-lived tenure, one night, chatting with Jeffrey Tucker and lamenting its fate, I had the idea of starting a fully online replacement journal, which became Libertarian Papers. I registered the domain that night and Tucker helped me quickly set up a site. I released our first batch of articles just a few weeks later, in 2009. A few years into it, Matt McCaffrey joined as editor. We published it for 10 years, until 2018, closing it after Judy Tommessen and Timothy Terrell approached me at an event in Auburn, and said that the Mises Institute was ready to resume the JLS. We felt we had had a good run and were tired of the hard work, so agreed to close up shop and turn over to them the articles in our pipeline, and our network of contacts and referees. I recall I also suggested to Tucker around 2010 that its daily article needed an official name for citation purposes, so they started calling it Mises Daily. This lasted for many years until the Mises Institute, after Tucker and French left, inexplicably changed the name to Mises Wire, just like they also inexplicably bifurcated the successful ASC into the Austrian Economics Research Conference, ARC, and Libertarian Scholars Conference, LSC, and got rid of comments on the blog, and purged old comments for no obvious reason, broke links, and reversed course on their CC by policy, but more on all this later. Becoming Mr. IP. In addition, I was showered with unexpected and unasked for honors and invitations to speak. As I have elsewhere noted, my main interests have always been in libertarian legal theory, in rights theory, causation, contract law, and so on, and in incorporating the insights of Austrian economics to libertarian and legal theory. It was never intellectual property, though by now I have become somewhat known as Mr. IP. As I have explained by now many times, since I switched from oil and gas law early in my career to patent and IP law, in about 1993, for career purposes, I thought I ought to finally address the IP issue from a libertarian perspective since previous arguments for IP all seemed flawed to me. I thought IP must be justified, even if the arguments by Ayn Rand and others all seemed flawed to me. After studying the issue in depth for a year or two, I finally came to my current conclusion that IP is totally unjust and incompatible with libertarian property rights, around the same time that I passed the patent bar, 1994. I began to practice patent and IP law full-time, and also, in parallel, began to write articles critical of IP, the first in 1995, a bit tentatively at first, for fear it might harm me in my career. But before long I gave up my reticence and I decided to go for it, when I realized that it was not going to hurt my career. Clients don't care what your personal politics are and don't read such things anyway. Maybe I just didn't care, I was just not made to hold my tongue. This led me to prepare a more systematic paper, The Legitimacy of Intellectual Property, which I presented at the Law and Economics panel at the Austrian Scholars Conference in Auburn, March 25, 2000. I remember George Reisman, a pro-IP objectivist, in attendance, and asking at the end if I really meant that all IP law should be abolished. When I answered yes, he seemed a bit stunned and said no more. I published a condensed version of this argument, in defense of Napster and against the second homesteading rule, later that year in LewRockwell.com, and a longer article, Against Intellectual Property, APE, in the spring 2001 issue of the JLS. It was long enough to be republished by the Mises Institute as a monograph in 2008. To my surprise, for my 2001 JLS article APE I received the Mises Institute's first awarded O.P. Alford III Prize for scholarly article published during 2001 to 2002 that best advances libertarian scholarship, at the Mises Institute's 8th Austrian Scholars Conference, March 16, 2002. When I showed up for the 2002 ASC, I had no idea this was in the works. I remember Karen DaCosta and I walked in and encountered David Gordon, who muttered something like, "Oh, I see you are getting a prize." Karen and I exchanged glances as we didn't know what he was talking about. Sensing he had possibly let the cat out of the bag, he changed the subject and scurried off. Hans, as editor of the JLS, selected the winner. Years later, when the JLS had mostly disappeared and I published and edited libertarian papers in its stead, from 2009 to 2018, initially under the Mises Institute's auspices, I was tasked with choosing the Alford Prize winner for the best article in that journal. Over the next few years the article attracted lots of controversy and attention, but I believe it began to change minds. It is my impression that today most Rothbardians, Austro-libertarians, and anarchist libertarians of all types are overwhelmingly anti-IP, not that I take sole credit for that. I was not the first and never claimed to be. But a good deal of it, for sure. I just happened to be the right guy at the right time, when the emergence of the internet and digital copying began to make more than a sleepy issue that could be ignored. I was the right guy because I happened to be interested in libertarian theory, young enough to be energetic and ambitious and stubborn, and confident I could figure it out, who also understood principled libertarianism, law, and IP law very well, and Misesian Austrian economics, and who was steeped in Mises, Rothbard, and Hoppe. There is a reason, in fact, why Hoppe back in 1988, before the internet age, before any of the more recent, systematic libertarian criticisms of IP by Tom Palmer, Roderick Long, myself, Butler Schaffer, and others already saw the fundamental problem with ownership of patterns of information, with IP law. Well before I did, and even before the emergence of the internet and digital copying made it a more pressing issue. Hoppe already had the essentials, Misesian praxeology, Rothbardian radical politics, and Hoppeanism. I don't know. Is Hoppe a Hoppean? Was Jesus a Christian? Incidentally, let me pause to mention that none of this explanation is meant to boast, it is to explain how, from my perspective, I was obviously closely integrated into the intellectual fold at Mises. I was writing for them, speaking, working with and studying under their chief intellectual. I had been given a major award, I was soon to start the successor journal for the JLS and to be a major part of their Mises Academy program, more on this below. Honors, invitations, and senior fellowship. In any case, I was soon to be pulled even closer into the Mises Institute inner circles. In 2008, I was invited to deliver the Rothbard Memorial Lecture for the Austrian Scholars Conference 2008, entitled The Intellectual Property Quagmire, or, The Perils of Libertarian Creationism. Lew Rockwell also invited me to appear on the Lew Rockwell Show to discuss IP. The next year, I was invited to present a paper for the 2009 Mises University, Intellectual Property and Libertarianism. And yet again in 2011, I was invited to lecture again on IP at Mises University. So it was quite obvious to me that my work on IP was appreciated at Mises Institute. I had every reason to think that not only Tucker, and French, and Hoppe, and other scholars at Mises Institute did too. I had received the Alford Award for IP paper. I had been invited 2 years in a row to speak on this topic. Mises was adopting an open publishing policy, clearly influenced by my IP ideas, more on this below. Countless people, including senior scholars at Mises Institute, made it clear to me they agreed with my IP views and thought it was important. This includes Lew Rockwell himself. When I appeared on his podcast in 2008, he said, Kinsella is, the author of many legal books published in this country and abroad in his area of specialization. Today I want to talk to him about intellectual property, about the whole concept of government patents and government copyrights. He's really enacted a revolution in this area among libertarians. End of quote. And in fact, the day after my July 30, 2009 talk on IP at Mises U, I had the following email exchange with Lew. Subject, brilliant. From, Llewellyn Rockwell. Date, Thursday, July 30, 2009 at 10:03 p.m. 2. Stephan Kinsella. Your talk tonight, I am listening to the MP3, is brilliant. I am just sorry I missed the actual presentation, but when I got to the room, not only were all seats taken, but so was my reserved and marked one, by a lady, so I had to content myself with the recorded version, which I will send out as a podcast. From, Stephan Kinsella. Date, Friday, July 31, 2009 at 12:10 p.m. 2. Llewellyn Rockwell. Thanks so much, Lew. The Mises U is just amazing. I think it's one of the most wonderful things I've ever seen. SK? From, Llewellyn Rockwell. Date, Friday, July 31, 2009 at 12:16 p.m. 2. Stephan Kinsella. You are an important and creative libertarian intellectual, so stay close to the Institute. It is an increasingly fruitful relationship. From, Stephan Kinsella. Date, July 31, 2009, 12:19 p.m. 2. Llewellyn Rockwell. Thanks. Of course I will. End of quote. I thought it was very nice. But then I returned to my day job. To normal life. A couple months later, Joe Salerno invited me to be a senior fellow. This was again unexpected. Subject, invitation. From, Joseph T. Salerno. Date, Friday, September 11, 2009 at 3:22 p.m. 2. Stephan Kinsella. Hi Stephan. I would like to redress a long-standing oversight or, to use Hans's favored term, scandal in not having you listed among the senior faculty of the Mises Institute. So, in view of your long record of outstanding contributions to Misesian and Rothbardian political and economic thought, I am very pleased to invite you to join other distinguished scholars on the senior faculty of the Ludwig von Mises Institute. I look forward to hearing from you and hope that you will accept this invitation. Here is a link to the list of current senior faculty, http://mises.org/faculty.asper-archive. Best regards. Joe. From, Stephan Kinsella. Date, Friday, September 11, 2009 at 3:53 p.m. 2. Joseph T. Salerno. Joe, what an honor. I am not worthy of this, but gladly accept. I'll prepare a little bio if you want. Thanks, SK. End of quote. So I became a senior fellow, archived page from 2011, which I thought would be for life, or for a long time, but which lasted a mere 4 years, till 2013. More on this below. Tucker, IP, and Open Publishing. Returning to the impact of the anti-IP ideas on Jeff Tucker, at first he thought my IP views were the typical abstruse, academic, impractical nonsense of pie-in-the-sky theorists and that the attention it was receiving was somewhat ridiculous. But finally, he became convinced. As he wrote in January 2009, reviewing Baldrine and Levine's Against Intellectual Monopoly, 2008. Kinsella's anti-IP argument initially struck me as crazy on its face. As I considered it further, my own view gradually changed. It's not crazy, I thought, but it is still pie-in-the-sky theorizing that has nothing to do with reality. Kinsella's article appeared just before the explosive public interest in this subject. The patent regime has in the meantime gone completely wild, with nearly 200,000 patents issued every year in the United States, and 500,000 more in other countries, with 6.1 million patents in effect worldwide, and large firms collecting stockpiles of them. And the copyright issue has led to a massive struggle between generations. Young people live by pirating music, movies, software, whereas the old consider this practice to presage the end of the capitalist system as we know it. The music industry has spent billions trying to contain the problem, and only ended up engendering consumer embitterment and terrible public relations. Kinsella's article continued to haunt me personally. It took about 6 years or so, but I finally worked through all the theoretical problems and came to embrace his view, so you might say that I was predisposed to hear what these authors have to say. What I hadn't realized until encountering the Baldrine/Levine book was just how far-reaching and radical the implications of a detailed look at IP really is. End of quote. But eventually he reread it, and was eventually persuaded, becoming a convert, the John the Baptist to my Jesus, the Boswell to my Johnson, the Engels to my Marx, his colorful words. Something like this. The Mises Institute goes open source. For years we would both write on IP on the Mises blog and elsewhere, and repeatedly discuss these issues. We collaborated on what we both regard as an important piece, goods, scarce, and non-scarce, which I included in my 2023 book LFFS. More than that, he began to adopt an anti-copyright and open publishing model, putting Mises Institute works online for free and with a non-restrictive CC BY license on each book and on the site's footer. See this archived page. archiveofmises.org, June 2011, showing CC BY footer. As Tucker explained in a Mises Institute speech in April 2009. I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing today that makes such a difference. You know, you can't even compare the intellectual environment of then with today. The prominence of the Austrian explanation and of free market generally today is astonishing by comparison. The number of books that are coming out, you know, we're putting out, as I say, sometimes several books a week. And these are selling, the distribution is wide. And of course digital media has made a huge difference. Mises.org remains, I believe, the largest, most well-trafficked economics website in the world. And I didn't bring any data with me. It changes every day and it's impossible to keep up with, but it's massive. And it's true that Mises.org gets more traffic than the Fed or the UN or anybody else. So this is great. And we have of course now thousands of books online and tens of thousands of articles. And I don't know how many hours of media we have recorded now. And I know many of you listen to the podcasts constantly and watch the videos constantly. I mean, I think you could probably live a full-time Mises.org life if you wanted to. You know, just wake up in the morning and just live in Mises.org until you go to bed. And this could last for years. So one of the problems we faced recently is that our traffic has just really gotten larger than we can handle, and we wanted to create space for uploading ever more books. For example, Doug French mentioned that we're putting 50 years of the Freeman online. Very exciting stuff. We want to have the freedom to do that. There's lots more out there we want to work on. Many more. You look at the bookshelves of the Mises Institute, all this stuff needs to get out and nobody else is doing it. Somebody's got to do it, so we're going to do it. But we had to create the space. We have to have the server space. You bump again up against the limits of physical reality at some point. So our webmaster David Wexler had this idea that in light of all the recent studies we've been doing on intellectual property and the virtues of going open source, now that phrase is not going to mean a lot to everybody in the room. What it really means is being as open as you possibly can with your copyright permissions. We put the whole of Mises.org on Creative Commons, so that anybody can take anything without permission. Part of the driving force is we get so many requests for reprint rights we don't even have the staff to handle it. So we just said, oh, to heck with it, take whatever you want and print it. Leonard Read had the same view as far as fee was concerned. End of quote. And as he noted in a more recent interview with me, I am very pleased today to have with me Stephan Kinsella, an attorney who is the author of a 2001 article called Against Intellectual Property, and more recently, a large treatise called The Legal Foundations of a Free Society. He is one of the most important thinkers of our time, and I think he has had a huge influence on me. At some point in the mid-2010s, because his article came out, I thought it was probably not correct. I thought it was wrong, at least I thought it was a distraction. Essentially, what the article says is that intellectual property is an illegitimate concept, that ideas cannot be commodified and turned into property, and that the attempt to do so is destructive of market forces, information flows, and society in particular. This pertains to copyrights, patents, and yes, even trademarks. The thesis is shocking, and probably as you listen to this, you are thinking that cannot be true. Then nobody would have the incentive to create, and so on. These are the usual comebacks. But I promise you, if you think about it long enough, as I did for years, you eventually come to be persuaded. Because of that, I shifted in my own career to only publishing within the Commons. There was, at some point in this period, an innovation of the copyright status that made available to publishers what is called Creative Commons, with a number of different licenses and terms of use. So, in my own work, I embraced the Creative Commons license with only one provision of attribution. That has been, I think, a real key to the success of many of my own personal projects. Also, as a publisher, Brownstone only publishes in the Commons. As far as I know, we are the only ones. There may be other non-profits that do it, but I am not familiar with them. It is a completely different model. End of quote. French joins Mises Global, Mises.org as hub of Austro-libertarian thought. When Doug French joined shortly after Tucker's 2009 speech, he joined this mission. As noted in Doug's talk at the Mises Institute's 2011 Supporters Summit in Vienna, the Mises Institute's publishing program that they embarked on took formerly hard to find and expensive books and digitized them, put them up free online and in multiple formats: PDF, HTML, Kindle, EPUB, audio, and physical editions. In one anecdote, 353 first video, 449 of the second, Doug recounts how hard it was to obtain Austrian books and articles before the internet. And the books, you couldn't find them. I mean, you absolutely couldn't find the books. And you know, they gathered dust in libraries, if the libraries had them at all. In fact, I studied under Murray Rothbard and I read one of his books in the UNLV library. It was called The Mystery of Banking. And I read it while working in the banking industry. This was the clearest explanation of fractional reserve banking I'd ever read. I mean, I couldn't believe it. So I had to have a copy of this book. But I couldn't get it. Nobody had it. It was out of print. So one Saturday, I went to the UNLV library. I bought a couple rolls of dimes and I plugged the dimes into the copier, put a page down, turned the page, and so on. It took what seemed like hours to create my own copy of The Mystery of Banking. End of quote. I loved hearing this as it mirrored a similar experience of mine. As I noted in a previous post. In grad school in London, 1991-92, I found a copy of Rothbard's Ethics of Liberty in the University of London library. It was then out of print and hard to find. So I paid something like 10p a page to photocopy it by hand, vellum bound it, and for years that was my main marked up copy of that classic text, until the 1998 edition was released by the Mises Institute with an amazing introduction by Hans-Hermann Hoppe. End of quote. In any case, it is my view, and that of Doug and Jeff, that for a key period of time, the Mises Institute became the hub of Austro-libertarian information partly because of this open publishing program. People still talk about it. I was literally at a Ron Paul Institute event recently and several people told me that they vividly remember how useful Mises.org was in those days as a marvelous font of free information on liberty and sound economics, the natural successor to the role played in the previous 2 or 3 decades by laissez-faire books. This was before there were as many other similar centers around world, and when the other foundations and think tanks and centers still largely relied on stingy paywalls and copyright. Mises Institute would grant permission to anyone who asked for rights to republish or translate, and when other Mises Institutes started cropping up and gingerly asking permission to use the Mises Institute name, he told them go ahead. He even showcased them on the right side of the website. Who does that? People interested in spreading the ideas of liberty, that's who. It was even called Mises Global for a while, listed under Mises Global on the now inoperable Mises Wiki. There was a Facebook page, a short-lived and now defunct website, misesglobal.org, archive, started, I believe, by Jeff Tucker after he left Mises Institute. See these screenshots from 2011 from archive.org. Mises.org Archive 2011 Mises Global. Mises.org Archive, 2011, showing Mises Global links displayed on right sidebar. Mises.org Archive, 2011, showing Mises Global links displayed on right sidebar, close-up. As Helio Beltrao said in his Ludwig von Mises Memorial Lecture delivered on March 10, 2011 at the Austrian Scholars Conference 11. And if we are talking about people that would like to start an Austro-libertarian cell, you don't need more than to put up a site, and start translating and publishing material. Just do it. It's simple, and virtually costless. We've done it in Brazil, Gabriel Calzada has done it in Spain, the Joachims have done it in Sweden, Vlad in Romania, and likewise in Poland, Japan, Russia, Belgium, and other places. To build a great team, of course, is more of a challenge, but they are sprouting, because we have the example of Lou and the LVMe team. End of quote. And see Joachim Camper, Helio Beltrao and Mises Global, Mises Daily, June 14, 2011, regarding Ludwig von Mises Institute in Sweden. One thing that needs to be mentioned before moving on is that none of this would have been possible if it hadn't been for the totally open and generous policy of the Mises Institute, which allows anyone, anywhere, to use whatever material they publish. Before starting up we had many conversations with Mr. Jeffrey Tucker about this, and we were amazed by his open attitude, and extreme generosity. He truly understood not just the power of ideas, but also the importance of spreading them in a completely decentralized way. Of course, without this attitude we would not be where we are today, and on a global scale you can see that this attitude is really having an impact. When we started the Swedish Mises Institute, there were maybe 5 other Mises Institutes around the world, and today, 1.5 years later, there are almost 20. The Austro-libertarian starfish is truly here to stay. End of quote. Nowadays the repository of information at Mises.org is of perhaps less importance than it was in those days because there are more liberty-minded groups and sites with this and other content. But from the early 2000s for a good 10 to 15 years, the role of Mises.org was crucial. We could all feel it. Tucker even surmises that this all perhaps played some non-trivial role in the world we see now, when the Tea Party sputtered out and the 2008 to 2009 financial crisis and Ron Paul's 2008 presidential run expanded the number of libertarians. Mises.org, with its anti-IP inspired policy and mission, were there to help add some intellectual ammunition to the remnants of the Tea Party that Trump tapped into to win in 2016. Who knows? But a fun theory. Libertarian legal theory with Stephan Kinsella. Mises Academy and the high water mark. Meanwhile, Tucker and French spearheaded the formation of the Mises Academy, taking advantage of live, remote courses delivered over the internet. I conducted several from 2010 to 2011. These included multi-course lectures, Rethinking Intellectual Property, History, Theory, and Economics, twice, Libertarian Legal Theory, Property, Conflict, and Society, Libertarian Controversies, and the Social Theory of Hoppe, and one webinar, Obama's Patent Reform, Improvement or Continuing Calamity. Students loved it, one said, of the first IP lecture series. Thank you so very much for all the excellent work. Very few classes have really changed my life dramatically, actually only 3 have, and all 3 were classes I took at the Mises Academy, starting with PP 350. Keep up the good work. End of quote. I recall being paid perhaps over $100,000 for my role. I had assumed Mises Institute must have made at least this much from their cut. Doug French tells me now that in the early days of Mises Academy they perhaps goofed and the split with the speakers was too generous. It was more like 50-50, paid to early instructors like me, Bob Murphy, and Tom Woods. I was unaware of this until Doug just told me this at the time of writing this article. So in my view, in addition to forfeited speaking fees and reimbursements, various volunteer activities, their Mises Academy profits, my own significant financial donations, and so on, I have been a major contributor. Not that I was recognized as such. In recent years, when attending events I was told by Mises Institute fundraiser Christy Holmes that to attend VIP receptions I would need to contribute $10,000. I doubt this was asked of other VIPs or significant donors. But by then I was used to this shabby treatment. But I am skipping ahead. In any case, I thought things were going well with my relationship with Mises Institute. So it was quite surprising and upsetting when Tucker quit in November 2011, French followed in early 2012. At the time I was not sure why. Despite this, and even after Hoppe's demotion from the JLS, I would have assumed things for me would continue as before. But soon after they quit, things started to change. Tucker and French v. Rockwell, Behind the Scenes, 2008 to 2012. I ended up resigning my position as senior fellow in 2013, which I'll explain below. Only later did I begin to understand why this happened. At the time I was mystified. Before I turn to 2013, let me set out some of the background events between about 2008 to 2012. Some of the following is based on conversations with Doug French, Jeff Tucker, and others. I first met Jeffrey Tucker around 1995, when I started attending Mises Institute events in Auburn. He has been a friend of mine and collaborator of sorts for perhaps 25 years, since my Against Intellectual Property article in 2001, had been with Mises Institute since about 1985, about when Hans moved to the US to study and work with Rothbard. And as noted, he was the force behind Mises.org and opening up its content to the world. He was behind Mises Academy and supported me in helping start Libertarian Papers. After Doug French joined as president, they worked together on this exciting mission of providing the texts of liberty and sound economics to the world, just as the internet made this possible, while others were relying on copyright paywalls. Doug had of course been Rothbard's student at UNLV, and he was the recipient, in 2005, of the Center for Libertarian Studies Murray N. Rothbard Award and, in 2012, of the Murray N. Rothbard Medal of Freedom. He also endowed the Mises Institute's Douglas E. French Prize. The author of several influential books, such as Early Speculative Bubbles and Increases in the Supply of Money, 4th Expanded Edition, Palmetto Publishing, 2024, and Walk Away, The Rise and Fall of the Home Ownership Myth, Auburn, Alabama, Mises Institute, 2010. His most recent is When Movements Become Rackets and Other Swindles, the PFS Trilogy, Stephan Kinsella, ed. Houston, Texas, Papinian Press and Property and Freedom Society, 2025, which Hans and I encouraged and supported him in publishing. When Doug accepted the position as president, Doug and his wonderful, amazing wife Deanna Forbush, both longtime supporters of Mises Institute, uprooted their lives and moved to Auburn. Deanna, a successful attorney in Las Vegas working for a Philadelphia firm, managed to move her practice there, no easy feat. Doug was, and is, a wonderful man, and was a great first successor president to Lou's initial reign. We have since become close friends. He and Deanna are among the finest people I know, and are both longtime supporters of Mises Institute. In fact, Deanna was part of the equation when Doug was offered the role of president. She was very important to Bert and Lou. She had purchased coins from Camino Coin and spoke to Bert and George Resch often, and developed a relationship with them. With Doug as president, they envisioned her as the First Lady of the Institute. Under Tucker and then French, Mises Institute kept publishing books and under a CC BY model where possible. They started the Mises Academy, and so on, as noted. Rockwell had been president, but the plan was to eventually hire a president. Bert Blumert, who died in early 2009, an early key figure in setting up Mises Institute, along with John Denson and others, pushed for this. Blumert was then chairman and offered Doug the job of president. He moved to Auburn in 2009, with plans to buy a house. His wife Deanna worked to relocate her Las Vegas practice, with a Philadelphia law firm, to Auburn. They sold their house in Vegas. Lou was supposed to turn over his office to Doug and step down. But when Doug showed up, Lou was not happy and not ready to step down. He never did give up his office, then, or under Deist's or DiLorenzo's tenure. Grudgingly, he allowed Doug to assume some temporary title of executive vice president. Not an auspicious start. But eventually, after a few months, he was officially named president, and Doug and Deanna bought a beautiful house there befitting a new president and his Mises Institute First Lady, intending to make Auburn his long-term home. I visited him there after an after-conference gathering shortly after he moved in, and it was on its way to becoming a hub for activity and visits related to the Institute conferences and events. Doug told me, people asked me what I did at the Mises Institute, and I would say alls I do is make sure Jeff Tucker comes to work. Doug tried to expand Mises U, as did Jeff Deist under his later tenure, since there was room and Mises Institute had plenty of money. Most recent filings indicated, has over $80 million in assets, as of the end of 2025, plus Mises U was used to solicit funds from donors, who were happy to contribute to the mission of educating new minds. According to Doug, previously MI.2 I would take about 80 to 100 students, and was turning kids away. Doug asked Pat Barnett, and others, and learned that there was capacity to take more, perhaps up to 140 or so he attempted to expand the number of students accepted so that not as many would need to be turned away. This angered Lou. He told Doug that the purpose of MI.2 I is for Mises Institute to raise money. Money was raised from donors to support 140 students, but numbers were cut off at 100 so Mises Institute would make money. The goal was not to try to break even, but to make as much profit as possible. Doug made the mistake of thinking like a donor, of thinking about the Mises Institute's stated mission. Mises Institute Supporters Summit 2009 and awarding of Schlabbaum Prize for Lifetime Achievement in Liberty, Salamanca, Spain, October the 21st to the 24th, 2009. Now, in addition to the ASC and MI.2 I, Mises Institute would hold other conferences throughout the year, sometimes in Auburn, sometimes in other locations, such as Mises Circle events. For example, there was an annual Supporters Summit, often held at a resort in some other city, such as the Mises Institute Supporters Summit 2009 held in Salamanca, Spain in October 2009, in conjunction with the Instituto Juan de Mariana, at which the Schlabbaum Prize was awarded to Jesus Huerta de Soto. In other years, the prize was given to Hans-Hermann Hoppe, Ron Paul, Ralph Raico, and other Austro-libertarian luminaries. And incidentally, just the next year, I worked with Huerta de Soto, Steve Baker, Toby Baxendale, and others affiliated with Mises Institute, and the Cobden Centre to try to propose a bill to eliminate fractional reserve banking in the UK. Given the success of this event, French's joining as president soon after Salamanca, the increasing popularity of Mises.org due to Tucker and French's efforts with open publishing, Mises Academy, and so on, and the need to have an annual supporters summit, and the special connection of Austrian economics, sometimes called the Vienna School or Viennese economics, to Vienna, the home of Karl Menger, Eugen von Boom-Boverk, Mises, Hayek, Wieser, and so on. And the fact years earlier there had previously been a Mises Institute conference in Vienna. Given all this, French and Tucker organized a supporters summit in Vienna in 2011. Needless to say, it was a very popular and successful event. People still talk about it to this day. I wanted to go, but with my career and a young child at home, I was unable to attend. Lou Rockwell was scheduled to speak but cancelled. When French got back, Rockwell was not pleased, and he read Doug the Riot Act. Lou acted like he didn't know anything about it and had not approved it, even though he had, and had even been scheduled to speak. In Doug's speech in Vienna, Freedom Through Technology, he had promoted the website and basically talked about how the Mises Institute was going to change the world via Mises.org and all the open publishing and initiatives around it. Doug had said that for a lot of people around the world, the Mises Institute begins and ends at Mises.org. The speech incensed Lou. Lou said the speech was terrible and that what donors want is not the website but a building in Auburn. Of course, the supporters, speakers, and attendees loved the conference, and it was more expensive than most, but it still broke even. But most Mises Institute donors are locals and Americans, so Lou did not think it made any sense to hold such a conference in Austria, instead of a local one that he thought would be more likely to be attended by local donors. And then he started fussing at Tucker and French about the book publishing. He wanted them to stop. He told Tucker he had to shut down the book publishing program and run all editorial content by Joe Salerno. He said Mises Institute is not Walmart or Amazon.com and was not in the book publishing business. Tucker noted that when LouRockwell.com linked to books available at the Mises bookstore, Lou would link to the Amazon version with his referral code in the link so that he would get a cut of book sales instead of Mises Institute getting a cut via its online bookstore. 2 days later, Tucker gave his notice to take a new position at Laissez-Faire Books. As he told me, it was clear to me that my work there was done. It is not quite clear to me why Lou had this vaulty face. Perhaps it is because he or Mises Institute had purportedly had inherited Rothbard's copyrights and he started having second thoughts about the open publishing model. Tucker told me Lou said to him one time, "This is not the Kinsella Institute." Perhaps Lou started to regret Tucker's hype about open publishing and the anti-copyright message I and others had adopted, even though he had previously said of me, in 2008, "He's really enacted a revolution in this area among libertarians." Even though he had broached the topic of becoming president with me years earlier. Even though he/Mises Institute had praised me, and invited me to lecture many times, given me an award and senior fellow status. Maybe he was parroting Tucker's pro-Kinsella/anti-IP line, and never really believed it, and was starting to regret it. Maybe he is just fickle. I have been told that because he agrees to something and then later criticized Taft for then doing it, as when French moved to Orban to become president and Lou resisted this, after extending an offer to him, staff got in the habit of making him sign something as proof that he wanted something done, so that this could be produced later if he changed his mind and denied having agreed to it. See the Vienna example above. I don't know. I was unaware of all this at the time. It also could be, and this is just a guess, that David Gordon had some role in this. When Rothbard took Hans under his wing in 1985 and started promoting Hans and his argumentation ethics, he was the only voice in the Liberty Symposium commenting on it to wholeheartedly endorse it. Most others were critical. David Gordon also had a comment, "It is not critical, but says very little. It is basically non-committal." I noticed this when it came out, but no one else seemed to. I noticed over the years Gordon has studiously avoided saying one way or the other. I developed the view, which I still hold, that Gordon does not agree with the argument nor with Rothbard's ringing endorsement. But he did not want to dissent in public from Rothbard's praise, so he simply said something vanilla, non-committal. It could be that he was not happy about Hoppe moving to the US in 1985 and working closely with Rothbard for his final 10 years, but could do nothing about it. The same could be true, to some extent, of Lou. I don't know. When my IP ideas caught on and had influence at Mises Institute, it also involved my criticism of Rothbard's mistakes on IP. I have also pointed out some missteps in his revolutionary and pioneering title transfer theory of contract. If I may be allowed to use the verboten term revolutionary. Ahem. Maybe Gordon didn't like this. Maybe Lou didn't. Enter Mises Institute affiliated scholar Butler Schaffer. To his credit, seemed Schaffer opposed IP. I liked Butler. Good guy. He moderated an IP panel I was on at Libertopia in 2012. In his 2009 book Boundaries of Order, Private Property as a Social System, he had some brief comments that patents and copyrights are difficult to reconcile with property principles. And then in 2013, Gordon started trying to promote a little pamphlet by Schaffer as the libertarian case against IP. His little barely 15-page essay was published as a book, stretched to 60 PDF pages by using small pages and large print and adding an index and introduction by Gordon. As the Mises Institute page promoting the work states, a libertarian critique of intellectual property is a major contribution to libertarian legal theory, and an indispensable guide to a vital topic. But is it? This is a book that is barely 15 pages long. Butler's treatment of IP is a bit muddled, unsystematic and not comprehensive, and at most a minor compliment to my own work on this topic. It does not even mention my work. And yet Gordon writes, in his introduction, "Whoever heard of an introduction to a book that is only 15 pages long?" Intellectual property is a difficult topic, and a lesser author could easily get bogged down in legal technicalities. Not so Schaffer. As always, he penetrates to the fundamentals. End of quote. A lesser author. Gee, I wonder who he had in mind here. maybe Gordon was acting as Lou's attack dog, or maybe he sensed this would please Lou, given the growing tension between Tucker and Rockwell in Tucker's final years at Mises Institute, and given Lou's snide comments to Tucker that Mises Institute is not the Kinsella Institute. In any case, when he was ordered to put the brakes on the publishing project, Tucker quit, as noted, in November 2011. Rockwell hired Danny Sanchez to replace him. All publishing decisions were run through Sanchez, going around Doug. Doug was nominally president but kept finding out things second-hand. One day Lou said things aren't working out. Doug agreed, and so he quit. Lou had purged both Tucker and French. I didn't know I was next. Kinsella out. Now, as previously noted, I was not aware of much of this. I stayed friends with Jeff Tucker even though he was increasingly bad-mouthed by those still associated with the Institute. Hoppe did as well, and in fact invited Tucker to attend PFS the next year, in 2012. And I stayed an increasingly close friend with Doug French, who was also a regular and founding member, with me, of the PFS. Hans and I were both independent, you see, and paid no heed to subtle pressure to break with our old friend just because some people at Mises Institute were bad-mouthing him. Little did I know that resentment among some at Mises Institute had been building against me for some of the reasons mentioned above. Perhaps because Tucker had promoted my anti-IP work too excessively in his attempts to justify his open publishing program, perhaps because I refused to join in the blacklist of him, perhaps because I had had the temerity to point out Rothbard's mistakes on IP. Perhaps because Gordon or Lou or others never liked Hans's connection to and status as Rothbard's obvious intellectual successor in both Misesian economics and libertarian theory. Oral History David Gordon Part 1 2000, and 23-1004. But it became apparent that I was no longer one of their inner circle, that my ideas were not, in fact, embraced by the major figures at the Mises Institute, when, in an October 4, 2013 interview of David Gordon by Joe Salerno and Lou Rockwell, Gordon went after my IP and other views. Recall that this was in the aftermath of Jeff Tucker's and Doug French's departure from Mises Institute in late 2011 and early 2012, and was in the first 7 or so minutes of Part 2 of a 2-part, 2-hour entry in their oral history project, the entry focusing on Rothbard. Gordon said Jeff Tucker had promoted the idea of the Kinsella IP revolution, but that it was not, in fact, a revolution, that it was minor work building on some previous critiques of IP, full of flaws, and much ado about nothing. As he said, Salerno, David, what's your general position on IP? Or can you give us a criticism of sort of the anti-IP position? Gordon, oh, yes. Well, I agree, as in so many things, with what Murray Rothbard's view, and as he said in Man, Economy, and State, his view was that patents and copyrights both are acceptable only to the extent that people could arrive at the protections they provide by contractual arrangements on the market. And patents generally would be very difficult to get under that. But copyright, you thought you could get some but not all the protection of copyright by just having agreements to say, if you sold a book, the person got it, couldn't reproduce it, and then that person would have to incorporate the same proviso into any sale that he made of it. And at the time Murray was writing in 1962, there was quite a good deal of discussion of patents in the economics literature. I think Fritz Mockloop discussed it, other people. And the argument Murray had on patents was you couldn't really show that patents were necessary for economic progress. This seemed to be kind of a consensus position. At least a lot of people thought that it was very difficult. People might think, you know, when they first hear about patents, don't you have to have patents so inventors will have some incentive to invest? But it doesn't turn out to be that way. But when Murray wrote about this, although that was certainly his view, he didn't attach overwhelming importance to that. It's just a couple pages in Man, Economy, and State. It wasn't one of the bases of a free society that we don't have standard patents and copyright. But after Murray wrote, there were several libertarian writers, including Sam Conkin and Wendy McElroy, also Tom Palmer, who wrote general criticisms of intellectual property just as part of a libertarian political philosophy. But in recent years, there's been a great deal of emphasis in certain quarters on being against intellectual property. Jeff Tucker, who is one who has had a number of articles, he's promoted what he calls the Kinsella revolution. And what this involves is that Stephan Kinsella published an article on patents and copyrights. And this was, I think, originally in the Journal of Libertarian Studies, and then it had been reprinted as a small book. It had been translated into Italian, maybe other languages. But he summarized a lot of the standard anti-IP arguments, most of them taken from Tom Palmer. He had, in my view, some of the arguments weren't all that good. In any event, that article, that was pushed by Jeff Tucker, attracted a great deal of attention. They have the view, which I don't see any basis for, that abolishing IP, particularly ending copyrights, would promote some sort of tremendous growth in the economy. That there'd be avenues of information would suddenly become available to people. And as far as I can see, that's just claims. I don't see any basis for it. There is a book that came out by Baldrine and Levine that I reviewed with critical patents and copyrights, and I thought they had some reasonable arguments. They suggested, maybe if copyrights were abolished we shouldn't think that people would stop writing. There are other ways writers can earn money other than by having copyrights on their books, but they didn't claim there'd be some kind of enormous benefits just by ending copyright. So in my view, the whole issue of IP has been blown totally out of proportion. It's one issue, but it's not one of the central issues of libertarianism like opposition to war or sound money. It's just a minor point that's been blown up. And also, there isn't, in my view, a Kinsella revolution. Salerno, just to add on to that, Mises in Human Action pointed out that patents were a monopoly, and whether or not society should have them is a matter of efficiency. And Hayek later on said that regarding copyrights, that it's a state intervention that creates a class of people that live on books, and he didn't know whether that was a good thing or not. But to follow up, I understand with the Rothbardian proviso, what if someone were to say, someone who is anti-IP, well, you really can't have this because that would be already presupposing the right, that you have the right to prevent anyone from copying. How would you respond to that argument? Gordon, actually, that's an argument Kinsella uses in his article. But in my view, it isn't a very good argument because, see, what he says is you're begging the question in favor of IP. If, say, you took it that the author doesn't have the right to control who copies it, suppose you start with what Kinsella would want, everybody has the right to copy whatever they want, you would still have a contract, someone would give up that right on condition that the person selling him the book. As a condition the person selling him the book. So I think Kinsella is wrong there in saying that the copyright arrangements who contract are begging the question in favor of IP, that argument just doesn't work. Salerno, yeah, it seems very weak. Gordon, I will say, going on a limb, you'll find, if you look at many of Kinsella's arguments on political philosophy, there's something wrong with the argument. In my view, he will take certain figures, he'll say, oh, Mises, like he said, for example, he said Mises' view on creation of money was that it was just a historical point that money had originated from a commodity, but Mises didn't think that it had to originate that way. And that Mises did think that, and he gets things wrong on what Locke said, and other people, so generally when he takes an interpretation of somebody, it's very often wrong. End of quote. I guess I was not too surprised by Gordon, at this point, who seems to be sort of a snake or two-faced, and given my suspicions about his non-committal comments in Liberty, in 1988, on Hoppe's Argumentation Ethics article. Of course, it is still somewhat odd and out of place to do so in the first 7 minutes of Part 2 of a 2-hour oral history of Rothbard, and to aim it at an existing Mises Institute senior fellow. But I was more surprised by Lou and Joe. I was sure they both agreed with my IP views, even the previous history I have recounted above. Lou had previously said that I had really enacted a revolution in this area among libertarians. Now, to be clear, I have never made such a weird, grandiose-sounding claim, but Lou did. And here he is on a podcast, about Rothbard, with Salerno, who is also anti-IP, you know, the guy who invited me to be a senior fellow, after they invited me at least 3 times to come lecture on IP at Mises Institute, chortling along, or at least not disagreeing, when Gordon mocks the idea that I had made some important contributions to this topic. Yet when Gordon said, "So in my view, the whole issue of IP has been blown totally out of proportion. It's one issue, but it's not one of the central issues of libertarianism like opposition to war or sound money. It's just a minor point that's been blown up. There isn't, in my view, a Kinsella revolution." End of quote. Lou said nothing. WTF. The same for Salerno, he even seemed to join in, agreeing at one point that, of David's critique of my criticism of Rothbard's proposed contractual common law copyright/patent IP scheme, yeah, it seems very weak. Again, WTF. Are they now pro-IP? The new restrictive copyright policy sure would seem to indicate this, see the section Open Publishing abandoned below. Shades of Tom Palmer, an early anti-IP pioneer who also seemed to have crawfished later on IP. Damn, Salerno and Rockwell in the company of their old nemesis Tom Palmer. That's just weird. So against this backdrop, I was flabbergasted and surprised by these comments. Now I hasten to add that think Gordon is confused about and wrong here, but that is really irrelevant. Everyone thinks of David Gordon as some rare genius, but he is basically just an odd character with an above-average memory. Regardless, in this case, he is deeply confused and simply wrong on the IP issue, if he is even sincere in what he was saying. The point is they went after me like this. Perhaps Lou had another agenda, and wanted to erase the history of Tucker at Mises Institute, and I was connected to that. I don't know. As for Salerno, I had thought of him as a friend. I have often referred to him as one of the few high praxeologists, along with Hans Hoppe, Guido Hulsmann, Jeff Herbener, those who swim in the plasma of praxeology I.E., those who actually use and apply praxeology and integrate it into their work, rather than occasionally sprinkling the term into their comments. Hoppe also, like me, respects Salerno's scholarship. He even recently praised Salerno's genuinely excellent book Money, Sound and Unsound, and wrote I had considered Salerno and still consider him the foremost contemporary monetary theorist in the Austrian tradition. Yet in the meantime I have heard about Salerno being two-faced. For example, according to Tucker, he and Salerno were sitting in the room organizing an upcoming Mises U, and they were discussing inviting me to do a series on law. Salerno enthusiastically agreed. A few minutes later, Lou walked in and pulled up a chair, and Tucker mentioned that they were planning a law track taught by Kinsella. Joe interrupted and said Kinsella is not an economist and should not be speaking at Mises U. He instantly flipped his position. So I guess it is not that surprising that he also seemed to follow Gordon's lead and join in the attack, even though he had previously agreed with me. I still find it hard to believe Salerno was not from the beginning with me 100% on IP and still is, which makes his joining in with Gordon here even more pathetic. Anyone with integrity and a pair of balls would have demurred and defended me and my IP ideas. But I guess they had some goal in mind other than truth. A few days after the podcast came out, October 4, 2013, when I became aware of it, I mentioned it in a Facebook post, October 8, 2013, see screenshot below. I described what had been said. It was public, after all. I wasn't going to pretend like it hadn't happened. Kinsella Facebook post 2013 Gordon criticism. By the way, here are some of the comments on that post. Just to let you know, you converted me from my IP-loving ways a few years back. And now I can't imagine why anyone would support IP laws. It seems logically inconsistent for libertarians to support IP. Ash Smith? Salerno and Gordon are no surprise, but Lou. Michael Barnett. I'm surprised by all of it. They aren't convinced. We need the full Kinsella argument in a full-length treatise. Colin Sleuth Knight. I'm actually most surprised by Gordon. Matt Gilliland. There totally is a Kinsella revolution. Anna Christa. Kinsella played a key role in getting me to let go of IP. Today we published a paper in Nature Biotech describing a method to navigate 1,000s of gene patents. Sadly, the article is behind a paywall, but I felt this topic was best broadcasted in the arena of the IP believers, lest I waste time preaching to the choir. I am hopeful someone will Aaron Swartz it. If Gordon thinks it's no grand insight to view IP in this light, who cares? He did zero to convince me of the fallacy of IP. Kinsella is making an impact on others by building a sound and rational argument against IP to the point where it's motivating others to change their actions on it. My post above is proof of that. If Gordon knew this all along, he was less effective at convincing others of it, and it's really irrelevant ego-driven criticism centered on who had the idea first type of criticism. A priority date argument is circular logic in any discussion about the fallacy of IP. I finally listened to Gordon's 7 minutes and I think he lacks information in regards to the negative impact of IP. I wrote a blurb at the Daily Paul McKernan, The Epigenome and the Freedom to Read Your Own Genes, 2013, which highlights how IP hinders one's ability to read your own genome, and how this is a very big deal considering we now have the tools to read everyone's and personalize medicine. The ability to read one's own genome is as important as Bitcoin in that it enables freedom from the medical grid, and it is the Lackean equivalent of owning yourself. It's not as obvious today but will become so over time as people recognize how life-extending this technology will become. For him to state the anti-IP position is overblown is simply to not understand the hindrances it causes. Kevin McKernan. TLDR, Gordon proves that he's not much of a thinker. Michael Mogren. End of quote. Now at this time, Peter Klein, whom I also thought of as a friend, was the temporary acting executive director. See archive faculty and staff page, bridging the gap between French's departure in 2012 and late 2013, when Jeff Deist joined as president to succeed French. I remember discussing with Klein his decision to take on this temporary role. He was not interested in a permanent position, he was able to take a 2-year sabbatical from his teaching position. Probably he did not want to give up a secure job as a professor to take on a precarious job as president of Mises Institute, given how French's job had only lasted a couple years under the fickle Lou Rockwell. In any case, after my Facebook post pointing out that Mises Institute had posted a podcast attacking me, Peter messaged me to ask me if I thought it was appropriate for a senior fellow of the Mises Institute to be criticizing other senior members of the Mises Institute. I was thinking, what's actually inappropriate is for them to be attacking me, their senior fellow. What they should have done was apologize, cut out the inexplicable attack on me, and repost the podcast and focus on Rothbard. But I immediately said, Peter, you're right, remove me. Purge away, boys. I did not want to be associated with these snakes. I had had enough. I had bought and paid for my independence, now I was going to spend it. So I was no longer a Mises Institute senior fellow. My decision to stay independent, and to be my own benefactor, paid off yet again. At the time, I felt a bit bad for Peter, that he had been put in this position. But as far as I know now, and given his complicity with Salerno on Mises Institute's insider board with ousting Hans, his friendship was all along just as fake as that of Salerno's, and he is just as two-faced. I don't know. It's beyond my control. After an earlier post about this incident last month, I was sent this note. I listened to the 7 minutes of David Gordon bashing you on IP. It's important to understand this was not about ideas or arguments, but rather about excommunicating you. A decision had been made for whatever reason. The IP discussion was just a convenient way to declare to the world, Kinsella bad. If you were in their good graces, David would have praised you for developing Rothbard's nascent ideas on IP. End of quote. So I feel like now I am in good company. At least I was removed by a communication with the acting executive director, a fellow scholar, not a couple of non-academic low-level staffers, as Hoppe was. Aftermath. I was not really bitter about it. I didn't need these people, really, after all. I stayed close with Hoppe and PFS and French and Tucker, and did my thing. I figured fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice. In other words, I merely adjusted and realized. Okay, that's who you really are. Good to know. I didn't need these people or depend on them in any way. The wonderful ASC, which began in about 1992, I believe, and ran for about 20 years, was terminated after Tucker left. It was split, for no clear or stated reason, into the terribly named and impossible to remember Austrian Economics Research Conference, AERC, and the at first sporadic and occasional Libertarian Scholars Conference, LSC, which appeared to be a revival of an older LSC put on by Rothbard's and Blumert's Center for Libertarian Studies, a sort of predecessor to the Mises Institute. It was the original publisher of the JLS, for example. On occasion I have entertained the half-paranoid suspicion that the reason Mises Institute split the ASC into the EC and LSC was to keep me, Kinsella, away. The ASC was interdisciplinary, so legal and libertarian scholars like me were welcome along with economists and others. I had been a regular fixture at ASC since about 1995, so, I thought, maybe they were thinking that I won't attend the EC, which is economics focused, and the new LSC will be only sporadic and occasional anyway. But this is a bit too narcissistic and conspiratorial. Tucker thinks the reason such changes were made, disbanding and bifurcating the ASC, changing the name of the Mises Daily which he had pioneered, and which I had named, changing the blog format and comments policy and copyright/open publishing policy, was to erase and memory hole his influence there. As I surmised in Mises Institute Oral History Project, The Lost Rothbard History, 2013, after Tucker and French left, the main purpose of the Oral History Project and other changes was, perhaps, to rewrite the Mises Institute history minus their central roles. But who knows? But in the end, I even half made up with Mises Institute later, see below, more or less, and even spoke at and sponsored some of their events, but it was now with eyes wide open. And I was never really an insider anymore, as I had been during the Tucker years. One brief aside. After this happened, other than complaining privately to Hoppe and Tucker, I was mostly quiet about it. Hoppe was incensed, but there was not much he could do. I had already nuked the relationship. Tucker and French commiserated, having also been on the receiving end of Mises Institute treatment. But I was talking to Walter Block one day a few years later and he said something about me being a fellow senior fellow. I corrected him and explained that this was no longer the case. I told him what happened. As I recall, he was fairly silent, and just changed the subject and moved on. When Walter was himself recently ousted from Mises Institute, and other libertarian anti-war groups and condemned by Hans because of Walter's pro-Israel views, in an email where he was complaining about this, I reminded him of this, that when I had basically been driven out of Mises Institute, he hadn't seemed to care. He did not reply. Dipping one toe back in. Hoppe, Kinsella, and Michael Malice's toy helicopter, Mises 35th, Baccarat Hotel, New York, October 7, 2017. After I righteously rage quit in 2013, something I am still very proud of, I steered clear of Mises Institute and went my own way. I continued to write, speak, attend PFS and other libertarian events, as usual. But 4 years later, in 2017, Mises Institute was holding its 35th anniversary gala in New York City, October the 6th to the 7th, 2017, in honor of Rothbard. Like Doug French, I'll do anything to promote and celebrate the memory and ideas of Rothbard. Hoppe was giving the keynote dinner speech, Coming of Age with Murray, and it promised to be an elegant affair, and in one of my wife's and my favorite cities. Because of my wife's busy career and different interests, she could rarely, over the years, attend any of my libertarian events. She only met a few of my Mises Institute-associated friends on the occasions when they passed through Houston, and stayed at my house. So in this way she had met Tom Woods, Jeff Tucker, Guido Hulsmann, Doug French, and so on, but had never yet met Hans, whom she knew was important to me. Doug French, Joe Becker, Lee Igledy, Jeff Barr, James Yohe, Murray in Las Vegas panel, Conversations about Murray Sessions, October 7, 2017, Mises Institute 35th Anniversary Gala in New York City. So I wanted to go. But I had self-deported from Mises Institute in 2013, so to speak. I was whining about this to my wife and she said, well, aren't you buddies with Hoppe, and isn't he a big shot at Mises and tight with Rockwell? Yes, I conceded. Well, ask him to feel it out for you. So I called Hans, he called Lou, said Kinsella wants to come to the New York event, is it okay? Lou said sure. So I went, and my wife did too, and we had a grand time. We had a nice dinner with Hans and Guido and their wives at Il Gattopardo one night. In fact, one night Hans and a group of us were having drinks at my hotel, the Baccarat, which is very exclusive and hard to get into. Joe Salerno, Peter Klein, and some others were supposed to meet us there. Unfortunately, the doorman refused to let them in and my phone was on silent, so I did not receive their calls, so they never made it up. I did apologize profusely later. After this, I started attending Mises events again, on occasion. A couple times, as noted above, I was informed by Christy Holmes I could sponsor a speaker or event, or that if I wanted to attend VIP receptions I would need to contribute some large sum, like $10,000. For example, Mises Institute's 40th Anniversary Supporters Summit, 2022, promo materials provided. The cost, exclusive of room and incidentals, is $495 for Mises Institute members and $595 for non-members. Registration includes a reception and dinner Thursday evening, all meals Friday, including a black tie optional dinner, and all sessions and lectures. Society and Gold Club members also attend 2 VIP receptions. End of quote. So I did this. Also for the Supporters Summit 2021. For others I was invited to sponsor a speaker, as when I was invited to speak on a panel at Austrian Economics Research Conference 2019 on the significance of Hans-Hermann Hoppe, more on this below, several others, and I donated $500 each. For the 2024 Human Action Conference, styled 75 Years of Human Action, I was invited to sponsor Hoppe's keynote lecture, My Discovery of Human Action and Mises as a Philosopher. I split this $15,000 donation with Greg and Joy Morin. Hans never received these funds or even plane fare, he paid his own way. At the dinner we sponsored, with 20 or so people, Lou and I were seated next to Hans, at one end of the table, but Greg and Joy were relegated to the far end of the table, which was odd. As sponsors, they should have received primo seating, of course. When Greg raised the issue with Christie later, he was blown off, even though he was on the fake outsider board and a major donor. It became clear that it was always about money. Even if I was a sort of VIP or attraction myself and had helped Mises Institute in innumerable ways, with the JLS, Mises Academy, and so on, if there was a chance to soak someone who could pay, soak 'em. As I noted above, by then I was used to this kind of treatment. I only spoke one more time there, in 2019, when I was invited to appear on a panel on the significance of Hans-Hermann Hoppe, on the occasion of Professor Hoppe's 70th birth year. Just as Doug, and I, will participate in anything that promotes Rothbard, I will also participate in anything honoring Hans Hoppe. He is my friend and a treasure. I agreed to attend, on my own dime, of course, and also to sponsor the panel when asked. Also at one of these events, probably the Austrian Economics Research Conference 2019 or maybe the year before, as I mentioned earlier, Judy Tommeson and Timothy Terrell approached me and said that Mises Institute was ready to resume regular publication, the JLS, whereupon I and editor Matt McCaffrey decided to cease publication of libertarian papers, as of 2018, after 10 years of publication. We turned over the pending articles and our referee contacts to Terrell. Ever since then I have served, and still serve, to this day, as a volunteer outside referee for submissions to the JLS. For me, it is the libertarian enterprise and the ideas of liberty, justice, and sound economics that matter. I am always in favor of doing what we can to promote, spread, and develop libertarian theory and our ideas. The post-Tucker era. From its founding in 1982, and especially under Tucker's initiative with Mises.org and with French after he joined in 2009, and until 2012 when both Tucker and French had resigned, Mises Institute continually improved and attracted more supporters. But after 2012 and Tucker and French's departure, Mises Institute has declined in several ways, despite the efforts of Deist and Di Lorenzo. Losing presidents. First, after losing both Tucker and French, Mises Institute lost two more excellent presidents, Jeff Deist, who served from late 2013 to 2023, and Tom Di Lorenzo, who served from 2023 until he was terminated only a year and a half later in 2025. All three were excellent, and did what they could to keep improving Mises Institute, but due to various tensions and conflicts in goals and values, board structure issues, and other problems as discussed in Hoppe's Quo Vadis article, all three were lost. All three were substantial figures in the Austro-libertarian movement, and all three uprooted their lives to move to Auburn, in high hopes of being part of its mission and helping it move forward and grow. Frankly, to me, the way they were treated is an outrage. All three deserve apologies. Cancelling programs. Under Deist's 10-year tenure, he supported programs such as the E4B, or Economics for Business program that was being developed by longtime Mises Institute supporter Hunter Hastings, as well as the attempt to start an accredited graduate school offering a MA in Economics, spearheaded by longtime Mises Institute supporter Joe Becker. This was all ultimately opposed by Rockwell et al., as a waste of money, one of the reasons that contributed to Deist quitting, as noted in Hoppe, Mises Institute, Quo Vadis. This led to the termination of the graduate school and of Becker. Both Deist and Becker now work at Monetary Metals. The loss of the graduate program was especially tragic. It actually had been a long-time dream of Ludwig von Mises to establish such a program, potentially at University of Chicago. In fact, I recall years ago, probably around 2000, when a group of us had several meetings and did research on the viability of setting up an accredited graduate program in Austrian economics. I recall doing a good deal of research myself on the arcane and difficult accreditation process. As I recall, a number of us were involved in this early effort: Guido Hulsmann, Hans Hoppe, Joe Salerno, me, and a couple others. But it looked to be almost impossible, so we shelved the idea. So I was delighted when Deist and Becker revived the idea 20 or so years later. I still thought it was an uphill battle, but with resources, and the Mises Institute, of course, has plenty, and a full-time person, Becker, working on it, it was worth attempting. Salerno and Mark Thornton hated the grad school project from day one. It meant actual work for them. For example, adjuncts had to be hired to actually teach each class. The applicants, who were first thoroughly scrubbed and recommended by Joe Becker, still needed to be reviewed and assessed, which would require work from Salerno and Thornton who, after all, were on staff and paid by Mises Institute. Rockwell and Pat Barnett expressed enthusiasm for the program at first, but the Christie homes didn't think it helped fundraising, so what was the point? Some students actually made it through the full 2 years, complete with graduation ceremony to thrill donors, before it was immediately abandoned on Deist's departure in 2023. Pointless name changes, website changes, and journal confusion. In addition, as noted, various changes were made for no clear reason, such as changing the name of Mises Daily to Mises Wire, getting rid of comments on the blog and on articles, and also deleting all the massive troves of interesting and insightful comments on past blog posts and articles. The link structure to many books and articles was changed, but without redirects, so that users often encounter 404s. It is difficult to find material now. The JLS, for example, is separated into 2 parts now, older and newer articles. The library, greater than periodicals link, https://mises.org/library/periodicals, at the menu bar at the top links to older issues of the JLS, https://mises.org/library/periodical/journal Libertarian Studies, while a link at the bottom part of the page goes to newer JLS issues, https://jls.mises.org/, apparently hosted by Scholastica. The older issues are no longer sorted by issue or volume, so it is almost impossible to find some articles, issues, or volumes. And nothing on the home page explains why there are 2 different links to these 2 archives of JLS articles. The key is also bifurcated for no reason. This is inexcusable, given that these are the 2 flagship scholarly publications of the Mises Institute. Open publishing abandoned. Under Tucker's tenure, a CC BY notice was displayed on the site, implying that all content was CC BY. CC BY, meaning attribution only, you have to say who the work is by, is the least restrictive Creative Commons license. I sometimes use CC0 but its legal enforceability may not be clear, and I think CC BY is a perfectly reasonable choice if one's goal is to spread one's ideas, and to make it easy for others to republish and translate your material. Otherwise, with a normal copyright, or a more restrictive CC license, permission would be required to reuse the material. After Tucker and French left, the previous CC BY notice was quietly deleted, and is only now used sporadically. As of this writing, Mises Institute uses a patchwork of Creative Commons license, sometimes CC BY but sometimes more restrictive licenses. The JLS site, well, one of the 2, asserts open access licensing and copyright. Since Volume 23, 2019, papers have been published under a Creative Commons CC BY 4.0 license. The full text of all content is available for free and open access without delay. The CC policy is similar. However, recent books, such as Ralph Raico's The Struggle for Liberty, A Libertarian History of Political Thought, Auburn, Alabama, Mises Institute, 2025, are published under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial 4.0 International License, or CC BY North Carolina. North Carolina, non-commercial. It's a bit ironic, or one might say, confused, for a pro-capitalist, pro-free market institute to adopt a policy discriminating against activity done for monetary profit. What's wrong with someone making a profit, for heaven's sake? Why is it okay for someone to copy my work attempting to spread the ideas of liberty but only if they don't make a profit off of this? Not to mention the incoherence of the distinction, for Austrians at least, between usage done for profit and not for profit. After all action is aimed at psychic profit. Even action aimed at monetary profit has psychic aspects. The distinction between commercial, or for profit, and non-commercial use makes about as much sense as the distinction between private and public goods, another distinction Hoppe and Misesians reject. The MI.2 I's copyright license policy is even worse. The reprints, permissions, and copyright for MI.2 I articles page specifies that MI.2 I articles are published under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License, or CC by North Carolina ND. The three MI.2 CC licenses, one good one and two evil ones. The problem here is that because of the North Carolina copyright license limitation used for MI.2 I and in recent books, this material cannot be used for profit or commercial use, meaning any website that has ads, or any publisher that is for profit, does not qualify. And the ND limitation in the CC by North Carolina ND license used for MI.2 I articles means no derivative works, such as translations, can be made. So in practice, the CC by North Carolina and CC by North Carolina ND licenses are almost the same as a standard, restrictive copyright, but unlike a normal copyright usage, which does not pretend to be open, gives the false impression that open publishing is being used, when it really is not. Most users and readers are not familiar with the arcana of copyright and CC licenses, so obviously do not realize the implications and significance of this change. Which is why they get away with changing it with only me shouting in the wind. In fact, I was recently talking to Manuel Ogando, who runs Mises.pt. I noticed a CC by North Carolina ND license on one of its articles, see archived snapshot. Even more confusingly, the CC by North Carolina ND image actually linked to the CC by license at creativecommons.org. Knowing he is Kinsellian on copyright, I asked him why he was using the evil, illiberal CC by North Carolina ND license image. He told me he had simply copied what was on Mises.org, assuming this was the old open publishing model. After I corrected him, he modified Mises.pt display the correct CC by image. But this is what happens when you reverse course and betray your principles. People who admire you will follow your lead. The status of other works at Mises.org is uncertain since there is no footer or notice applying a particular licensing policy to the whole site, so presumably some material at Mises.org is still under normal copyright protection. These changes have led to confusion and backtracking. For example, my 2005 Mises Daily article "There's No Such Thing as a Free Patent," Mises Daily, March 7, 2005, has no notice at all and does not appear to be covered by the MI.2 I policy. As there is no overall copyright page on the site setting a default policy or CC by footer covering the whole site anymore, the reader has no way of knowing. This means that anyone wishing to reuse material on the site has to assume it is covered by copyright and that permission is needed. In other words, there is no clear CC by policy at Mises.org except for JLS and G articles. I did talk to Judy Tommessen and Timothy Terrell in 2018 or so when I agreed to close down Libertarian Papers as the JLS was resuming regular publication, and explained to them that after Tucker left in 2011, the Mises Institute website had seemed to backtrack on its formerly open publishing and CC by policy. Perhaps this is why the JLS and G still employ CC by, while the rest of the site is either in limbo or uses more restrictive licensing policies. Or perhaps one reason the name Mises Daily was changed to Mises.2 I was so that new articles could be covered under the CC by North Carolina ND license. Or maybe they are in disarray and the left hand does not know what the right hand is doing. Who knows? But after several complaints by me which were ignored, and knowing I am somewhat of a specialist in IP who could have been consulted, it is obvious that they do not care if they have an open or even coherent copyright policy. I guess noted IP expert Butler Schaffer was also not available. I should note that once material is published under a permissive CC by license, the publisher technically has no right to reverse this, but as I have noted, this is one problem of CC licenses in general. There is no bargained and signed license agreement, so users have no easy way of proving they did have a license. Because copyright law is arcane and unnatural, everyone gets it wrong. Copyright notices tend to be inaccurate all across the publishing industry, especially non-profits and think tanks. and in fact, some of my own material published at Mises.org and in their journals have incorrect copyright notices. If an author does not assign copyright in writing to a site or journal, he retains copyright. So it is simply factually incorrect, and legally ineffective, to state copyright Mises Institute on, say, a work I wrote. Mises Institute would only have a license to publish it, but I retain copyright. This is one reason that I posted my own PDF of the Mises Institute's version of my ape, which strikes out the Mises Institute copyright notice and includes a CC0 license. One final note here, it is actually potentially criminal, under 17 U.S.C. section 506c, to put a fraudulent copyright notice on a work. So if I were publishing others' work, I would be careful not to falsely put a copyright notice on it stating that I held the copyright instead of the author, nor would I change a previously granted CC by copyright notice to a more restrictive one, giving the false impression that the user is not free to copy under the initial CC by license. But hey, that's just me. On the other hand, I would never want to try to make a copyright license narrow on purpose in the first place. Moving forward. The problems highlighted in Hoppe's article concerning the Mises Institute structure are probably one source of this decline. In one way, this is a natural result of what has been called founders' syndrome. After over 40 years, and with the founder in poor health, and after losing 3 solid presidents in a row, it is time for a change. In addition, the current structure of a real or insider board of subscriber members who can terminate the outside or non-subscriber members, and where the real/insider board is populated by Rockwell, relatives and close associates, seems to have contributed to the problem. Another is the nature of non-profit organizations in general. They operate without clear profit and loss signals and constraints, and if successful at fundraising, it is almost inevitable that the mission becomes preserving the funds and fundraising and having comfortable jobs for oneself, one's family and cronies. In addition, to qualify as a non-profit and maintain public charity status, and avoid being classified as a private foundation, the organization must meet the public support test. This requires the organization to receive at least 1/3 of its total support from the general public, measured over a rolling 5-year period. This rule effectively forces many public charities to engage in ongoing fundraising, even if they have substantial savings or endowments. If the organization fails to meet the test, it is automatically reclassified as a private foundation. This results in excise taxes, a requirement to distribute roughly 5% of non-charitable use assets each year, more complex filings and compliance costs, and limitations on self-dealing and less flexibility compared with public charities. In any case, if Mises Institute is to have a president, he has to have authority to implement his decisions and vision, and support and guidance from the board, and one where his subordinates, such as Salerno, are not also on the board. The president also needs to have the authority to fire and replace employees if necessary. I am no expert in such matters, but it seems to me it is time for something to change so that a quality president can be hired who knows he has not only the responsibility and opportunity to try to make a difference, but the authority needed to do so. To get a quality candidate, he needs to be reassured the same fate that happened to French, Deist, and Di Lorenzo will not befall him, and due to this, it seems obvious that the concerns expressed in Hoppe and Hulsmann's 2025 memo should be addressed. Board structure and composition. This would mean, most importantly, changing the board structure to a real board, not one bifurcated into subscriber or inside members and outside board members who can simply be terminated by the inside board members. The current Mises Institute board and finance page confusingly refers to independent voting members and affiliated voting members, a nonsensical distinction. In reality, as noted in Hoppe, Mises Institute, Quo Vadis. The real board consists of an inner board of 5 permanent or subscriber members. These are the board members exercising true control of the organization. Next to Lou, the inner board includes, most problematically, Joe Salerno, a paid employee, Peter Klein, professor at Baylor University, but also on the Mises Institute payroll as so-called senior academic advisor and Salerno's sidekick, and then there is Lou's sister and his sister-in-law, whose son and daughter-in-law are institute employees. The other board members appear to have no real power and are mostly window dressing, since the inner board members can exercise an ultimate veto in that they can remove any other non-subscriber board member, as we saw with Judge Napolitano. The outside board members include Ron Paul, age 90, John Denson, age 90, Don Prince, age 85, and 3 low-profile donor businessmen, Steve Torello, Mark Murrah, and Yusuf Ahmed. It is a joke to claim that this inner board could or would exercise any serious control of the inner workings of the Institute's new executive directors, given that over half of that group are paid employees of the organization or have close ties to such employees. Even if there is no self-dealing, the very structure invites that temptation while appearing suspicious to any outside observer. That this structure is obfuscated by a surrounding layer of outer board members is telling. End of quote. In my view, the current board structure should be changed, which would of course require support of the current 5 inside board members, which is unlikely, to a normal, flat board structure. This board would have no employees, family members and so on, but would consist of significant donors with some business savvy, and other suitable members such as significant intellectuals who share the Institute's values and mission, such as Hans-Hermann Hoppe and other relevant significant, trusted Austro-libertarian Misesian Rothbardian scholars, those with relevant expertise in finance, fundraising, marketing, management, strategy, and legal affairs, and so on. In this case, given the Mises Institute's embattled history and its loss of 3 past presidents who all faced and witnessed problems at Mises Institute, I would suggest the new board include also all 3 of these former presidents, namely Doug French, Jeff Deist, also, helpfully a lawyer, and Tom DiLorenzo. Employees and board composition. No employees would sit on the board. The president or other executive director or CEO would serve as a non-voting ex officio member. No board members would receive compensation, including the chairman. Lou Rockwell currently receives a salary of $215,614, according to the most recent ProPublica report, Mises Institute, which appears to be very non-standard in the non-profit world. Foundation versus public charity. If all this were done, the board ought to bring in sufficient advisors to determine whether to operate as a public charity, or as a foundation. President. As noted above, the president should have both the obligation and responsibility to manage the Mises Institute, as well as the authority to implement his decisions and vision, with support and guidance from the board. This would include the authority to fire and replace employees if necessary. None of his subordinates should sit on the board, as is already implied in the criteria laid out above for the board structure and composition. Mises.org, copyright and open publishing/information. The CC BY policy previously used should be adopted again, and the website overhauled so that old comments are restored, broken links fixed, and the JLS and G unified in one place each, with all back issues and volume easily findable. Its most useful programs, in particular the Mises U, could be expanded to invite as many students as possible, even if it is more costly. Surely the donors who have provided funds would be in favor of such expenditures. All these are easy fixes if there is a president who understands this, and has the support and resources to get this done. Expand Mises University, reconsider graduate school. As above remarks indicate, Mises U should be revamped, as necessary, and expanded to a larger number of students, if feasible. The graduate school initiative, started by Deist and Becker, and long a dream of Mises himself, should be reconsidered. Conclusion, a hope and a forecast. And then perhaps, after righting the ship and getting back on track, Mises Institute can remedy the grievous error of ousting Hoppe, apologizing, and humbly asking him to return, possibly as a board member, as suggested above. But what are the odds of this? Not high, I would say. Regarding democracy, Hoppe wrote this. What should one hope for and advocate as the relatively correct immigration policy, however, as long as the democratic central state is still in place and successfully arrogates the power to determine a uniform national immigration policy? The best one may hope for, even if it goes against the nature of a democracy and thus is not very likely to happen, is that the democratic rulers act as if they were the personal owners of the country and as if they had to decide who to include and who to exclude from their own personal property, into their very own houses. This means following a policy of utmost discrimination, of strict discrimination in favor of the human qualities of skill, character, and cultural compatibility. End of quote. Mises Institute is the way it is because of the nature of non-profit organizations in a society with high taxation and where the non-profit distinction even makes sense, and because of the self-interest of those in control. My guess is nothing significant will change, the board structure will not be changed, and because of that, there will be no new president who is actually in charge. As Hoppe wrote in Mises Institute, Quo Vadis. I am not under the illusion that any of this will have any noticeable effect on the Mises Institute and its operations. The Mises Institute sits on an endowment of more than $70 million. Non-profits almost never implode, and with this endowment the institute can limp along for decades, almost regardless of what it does or doesn't do. There is always a clueless generation of older donors leaving some big estate gifts behind, and there is always another generation of new donors coming along, attracted by a good show and some freebies. End of quote. In all likelihood, it will in fact continue to limp along for decades, benefiting its staff, no doubt, and providing some type of benefit to students and others, but less than it might. I hope that even if it goes against the nature of a non-profit, and thus is not very likely to happen, that I am proven wrong.